Okay, welcome to our first lecture in Christian ethics. And our discussion today is the foundation of ethics. What is ethics? How do we think about ethics? How do we set a foundation for the basic core philosophical and conceptual questions of this field? And I'll start then with what I just said, a definition of ethics. What is it? I think in popular or practical discussion, what I normally hear as the functional definition of ethics is how to choose what is right when facing complex or difficult conflicts. The kinds of questions where you're deciding between this and this, maybe you're going to have to lie in order to save someone's life, or maybe you're going to have to defend yourself and hurt another person before they hurt you. The kinds of difficult quandaries or conflicts or paradoxes where we're not sure exactly what would be the right thing to do because two things seem to be in conflict. Now, that's not that's not an alien discussion to ethics. That is not separate from ethics. That is part of ethics. Here's what I'd like to say at the outset in our discussion of ethics. That is only one tiny part of ethics. In other words, if all we're talking about are these complex, weird, challenging, difficult, marginal cases, the strange situations, then we're going to find ourselves focusing on those, what we actually refer to as sometimes ethical dilemmas. We're going to focus on the really confusing situations, and we're going to miss the real point of ethics or the core of ethics. Ethics is far more broad than just the odd or unexpected or challenging issues. Well, what else could we discuss then in order to try to understand this field or understand what ethics is? Another thing that comes up as a closer definition, we're starting to make progress now, working through and actually reaching a good definition, is that we sometimes talk about ethics as essentially an expression of practical theology. Okay, now for that, let me put up a diagram. Let's think about the divisions of theology for just a few minutes, kind of see how the pieces fit together. So something you should know in the way that theology works, there is a kind of a good progression that you ought to be aware of, starting from exegesis. When we're asking a question, a theological question, we would start with, what does a text mean? So if you ask something like, I'm reading in Romans 9, I'm struggling to understand, what does it mean? You're doing exegesis. From there, you will find yourself putting together pieces from lots of different texts. And when you try to bring together all those texts and reach an understanding of the flow across Scripture, the big picture story of the Bible, now you're doing biblical theology. Systematic theology is what happens when you're asking questions about what is true about God. And in this case, I think the difference between this and biblical theology might go that systematic theology is really a case where the text itself never raises the question. It's something we wanted to ask. So an example of a systematic theology question might be, what happens to a small baby that dies? How would we argue that that baby is in the presence of God? They are a sinner. They are condemned because they're guilty. So how would we argue for the life of that baby? And I do believe that there are reasons we should assume or understand that that baby is in the presence of God. But that's a systematic theology question. Other examples, the Trinity. What is this? How does it work? What's going on here? The incarnation, fully God, fully man. How was that possible? And so on. There's one other, and I'm going to take you off to the side just to show you this. This is historical theology, the purple on the side. And the purple on the side is to say certain cases where we recognize that we want to study what different believers have taught or what different believers have said in the history of God's people. That takes me finally to the last. At the very top, you see practical theology. And practical theology is how we should live. Or that's the question that we find ourselves addressing here. How then should a person live? And my argument here goes that very often we're tempted to look at these branches, these divisions, or this process of thinking, and we're tempted to assume that ethics is, okay, that's really simple. I know that one. Ethics is just the top. Ethics is that last quadrant or that last square as we progress through the different ones. And so if I'm working through systematic theology questions, exegetical questions, biblical theology questions, if I'm working through all of the questions that we just discussed together, at the end of the discussion, if I reach the top now, practical theology, that's ethics. I would like to just say here, though that's not a bad answer, it's a pretty good start. I'd like to go a little bit further still. And what you can see is what I'm doing here with the definitions is I'm kind of moving further and further out. Each one of these I'm adding an additional idea or an additional component. So I'm going to move now to putting ethics in light of philosophy. And by philosophy, I am, of course, talking about a primarily or functionally secular discipline. I'm talking about people that discuss really abstruse, abstract, difficult, complex questions. And we're asking those kinds of questions because we're trying to understand the world and what is true. But actually, philosophy breaks down into 3 divisions, and let's talk about these. The first division, if we ask something like, or if our question is, what is real? Then what we're doing here is called metaphysics. Just to explain what we mean by the language of metaphysics or that kind of concept. If I'm asking something like, why does the universe exist? Where did the universe come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is the cause of everything we see? Or what is the difference between something that's real, like this podium, versus something that's not real, like ghosts or unicorns or Santa Claus? What makes one thing real and the other thing not real? What's the difference between them? Those kinds of questions are metaphysics. So if I'm asking what is real, then I'm doing metaphysics. A second division for philosophy. If I'm asking what is true, we call this epistemology. Now, these are not necessarily words that you might use regularly, but they're helpful words to know. I would recommend that you go ahead and learn these words and be able to identify which one is which. By asking what is true, then we would be asking questions like, why is something logical and something else not logical? What does it mean to be logical? What is logic? And why is logic helpful? Why do we use logic, or why do we depend on logic? And why does logic seem to lead us towards truth? How does that even work? And what is the idea of something that's true? How would I know? Or how can I learn to detect truth? How can I try to believe only things that are true, but how can I really be sure that my beliefs are actually leading me towards truth? The third, though, is if I'm asking the question of ethics, and the question here would go something like, what is good? Or what is right? And this we typically identify as ethics. This is the third division, 1, 2, 3. The 3 divisions in philosophy. And this third then, ethics, exploring this question. What is good? What is right? How would I know? Or how would I be able to understand and live accordingly? And these are important questions, and they're important questions that preoccupy philosophers. And we struggle with trying to understand how these questions can be answered. So that's a pretty good way to go about understanding ethics, I think. But I'd like to make our definition as broad as possible. And here's my definition that I'm going to propose that we use, kind of a functional definition for this class. Ethics teaches us how to live well. Ethics teaches us how to live well. Now, I'm going to add a few other components of meaning to this. So I mentioned just a moment ago that we in philosophy might talk about what is real. We might talk about what is true. We might talk about what is good. So if I wanted to expand this definition further, I could say ethics teaches us how to live well in light of or because of what is true or what is good. Actually, we're going to say what is true, real, or good. That's my fuller definition. What I care about the most is this part of the definition. You've got to know that. You've got to know the whole thing, really. But this is the functional definition that we'll spend the most time with. Ethics teaches us how to live well. Now that gets us into a thicket of lots of other questions, because at this point, you've got to answer a bunch of other things. What I just said. Ethics is built on the foundation of what is good, what is right, what is beautiful, what is true, what is real. And if you start thinking through it in these terms, then you can see how all of these are actually deeply connected. So we talked about the branches of philosophy, what is real, metaphysics, what is true, epistemology, and then ethics, what is good and right. You can see how these are connected. If, for instance, what is real is just, well, the universe began in the Big Bang, and then we evolved, and then we're going to live, and eventually we die, and that's the end of us, but there's nothing more to it. There's nothing more to the story. There is no afterlife. So the goal at that point is just to evolve and survival of the fittest, I guess. See, if that's your definition of real, then your ethics will be shaped by that. Why try to do what's right, or try to obey a deity, or why try even to worry about loving other people or caring about them? It makes no difference if all that is real is what I can see. The same thing with what is true, if I'm talking about the second here. If I don't believe the truthfulness or the truth value of Christianity, if I don't believe that God has actually spoken to us in his word, and so therefore as I open this book, the Bible, this is God speaking to us. If none of that is part of my worldview, then at that point, who cares? Why should I listen to him? Why should I try to obey him? So you can see then that ethics is connected not just to the metaphysical question, the question of what is real, but also the epistemological question, what is true. It's that last one that I'd like to think about just a little bit more. And that is the concept of ethics related to what is good or beautiful. There's another branch of philosophy that sometimes gets talked about. It's called axiology. Axiology is the branch of philosophy that wants to think about value or goodness, beauty. How would I look at one painting and say this is great art, and look at another painting and say this is cheap art? And making the difference in those distinctions, the distinction between those. Or how do I even look at something and call it art at all? I mean, maybe a pile of trash is art. Why do we say that human beings are more important than mosquitoes? Like, what is it about a human being that makes them more important? Why should I care about concepts like wisdom or virtue or courage or self-sacrifice? Maybe I just need to get everything I can get for myself. Those are the kinds of questions that are concerned with value. What is valuable? What is good? And that's, as I said, a definition of, or a question of axiology. But you can move right out of that right into ethics. If being courageous or self-sacrificial is a good thing, I ought to do it. And if it doesn't matter, if there is no value in it, I won't worry about it now, will I? Axiology, or what my values are going to connect into what I believe or follow as my ethic. There's one other term I want to introduce to you now, and I'll talk about it at length in a future lecture. But there's a concept also in philosophy, a branch of philosophy, called Eudaimonism. Eudaimonism is the branch of philosophy that thinks about or explores the question of what is the good life. So let's just imagine two people, they both get born, they both live on planet Earth. One makes it his goal to make money and be famous and have everyone like him. And so at the end of his life, that's what he's accomplished. He's a famous basketball player. He's a famous musician. And so everybody thinks he's great, and then he dies. Another person makes it his goal to live virtuously. And so he takes care of his neighbors, takes care of his family, he's kind to the people around him. At the end of his life, nobody knows him, but he was a really good father. He was a really good grandfather, a really good husband. Between those two people, who lived the better life? And those kinds of questions are around this issue of, or this discussion of Eudamianism. What is the good life? If you find your heart inclining to say something like, oh, happiness, I want to be happy. And in order to be happy, I think I'll need to get married. If that kind of thought hits you, you just answered a Eudamianism, or a question of Eudamianism. You just explored, or you just answered the question, what will make me happy, or what is a life well lived? And you answered with your assumption, well, I think being married would be nice. And I actually happen to agree. Or if you encounter other questions, someone says, well, I want to get rich, I want to be famous. And your answer to them is, yeah, but being rich isn't going to actually make you happy. You'll always want more. You're actually doing a philosophical discussion there. You're discussing this issue. What actually makes for the good life? And you can see that this issue also is tied in inextricably, or it's connected directly to the question of ethics. If you can tell me what is the good life, put in some answer, wealth or fame or continual positive emotional states, lots of good relationships, lots of people that remember you so that you aren't forgotten 100 years from now, accomplishments, a good job, lots of work so that you're able to do something that contributes to humanity, whatever it is. If you answer that question, here's what I think the good life is, or here's what I think the successful person does, that will tell me then what is probably going to be your ethic. Your ethic will derive off of that issue. Let me take you to a couple of core questions of ethics, or issues that regularly come up in ethical discussions. And I think you're going to find that these are closely related to things that we've already been saying. So all of this just fits in as one big picture. All of it is related to each other. But some of the core questions for ethics, how about these as discussions of ethics? Number one, what are the right or righteous actions? What does it mean, or what is the definition of sin? Second, what does it mean to live well? That's our discussion that we've been having, Eudamianism. What is the successful life? How would I decide? Finally, one that I think we might be blind to, but we ought to recognize. How do I change? How do I control the monster within? And for this, we might miss this one, because when we answer the previous questions, okay, I know what's right, I know what would be a good life, or I know how I ought to live, then we might just immediately assume, and so then I'm going to go out and do it, right? I mean, because I know it's right, and that's what I'll do. I know that this is the successful life. I mean, who wants to be sad? I want to be happy, so of course that's what I'm going to do. What I'm wanting to highlight with this final question is, it's not so simple though, is it? Because you might find yourself casting a certain vision of the life you want to have, or the person you want to be, or even a vision of what is right and good, and you believe it. You truly and genuinely believe that that's what you ought to do. You just struggle to do it. In fact, I would take it one step further. It's not that you might struggle with doing it. It's not that you might struggle with being the person you know you ought to be. I would argue that all of us as human beings do exactly that. Because all of us as human beings have a vision in our minds of some ideal of ourselves. The ideal of ourselves is, I don't know, always cheerful, or doesn't struggle, or doesn't get discouraged. It's the ideal of ourselves, the perfect of ourselves is hardworking, kind, never does things that would be against your concept of right and wrong, and so on and so forth. You have in your mind an ideal of the person that you think you should be, or even the person that you wish you were. And what I'm arguing here is that none of us are actually anywhere close to that ideal, not even according to our own ideals. In a later discussion, we'll point out that our ideals are themselves faulty. And if we were honest with ourselves, what we have to be doing, what we must be doing, is accepting God's ideals, God's vision of what we ought to be, which is a higher standard still. But even if I just settle down to our lower standard, the low standards on which we operate, I don't even think we meet ours. We don't even meet our own awareness of what we ought to be. I'd also like to point out a couple of what I'm going to call core philosophical foundations. These are a couple of things that we will discuss in the progress of this class. Number one, I'd like to point out that God's truth constrains our practical actions. I'd like to point out that as you and I go out and we make choices, those choices are built on our determination or our faith or our beliefs about what God has spoken. I think we also have to explore, and I'll end with this concept later on, what is the internal structure of our actions, meaning that when we end up making certain ethical decisions, let's say, for instance, we confess, someone asks us, is it okay to kill a cow? And we say, that's fine. Hamburgers are nice. Is it okay to kill a mosquito? Sure. Mosquitoes are obnoxious. Is it okay to kill a child? No. Why not? I mean, what is the difference between the child and the cow? And if you were operating on an evolutionary framework, you don't really have much of an answer for it really, except that you can say that the child is sentient, the child is able to be self-conscious. So anyway, that's at least a way forward. But you're kind of stuck, aren't you? A Christian is going to answer, the difference is that person's made in the image of God. That's your answer. Okay, so now what you've done is you've created an internal structure for your ethics. And your ethics, the principle that slices across is to say, people are different. People are different from cows, they're different from mosquitoes. You ought not kill people. You must treat people differently from cows and mosquitoes. Fair enough. Keep on going. So then I ask questions about self-defense. Someone comes into your home, they're going to attack you, they're going to hurt your wife or your children. And so what can you do to stop them? And most societies have some kind of provision, legally and otherwise, for you to fight back. Because you don't just sit there and let the person do what they're going to do. Okay, so what that tells me is the internal structure of your ethic is moving from people are different, or we're made in the image of God, if you're doing the Christian thing. Now you've worked through and said, yes, but when you come to a conflict between one person being hurt and another person being hurt, he's going to hurt my wife and my children, and I'm going to stop him, but that might involve injuring him. You've recognized that the two concepts are at odds, and that there's a kind of a priority of some sort between these things. Okay, that's what I mean when I say we have to be or ought to be aware of the internal structure of our actions. We try to say different things, do this, don't do this, follow this, don't follow that, make sure you use this principle, but don't fall into that error. And yet what we've got to remember is that there are also attempts to be consistent. We try to be consistent with our principles, not just make up new principles every time we come along. And finally, third core philosophical foundation is I want to continually push the idea or the question of how our actions relate to truth. One of the ideas that I desperately want you to grasp in this class is that we might separate out doctrine or philosophy or thinking, principles. And so it's like here we function, here's the things that are true, and we have like a realm in our minds. This is a faulty way of thinking. It's a bad way of thinking of it. There's the realm in our minds of truth, and then there's like the practical realm down here where we make different decisions. And those two things are somehow separate in our minds. What I'd like to argue here is that ethical decisions themselves carry truth freight. The ethical decisions you make have truth in them. And therefore, if you start messing around and you're going to do certain things that are unethical, things that go against what Scripture says or go against your principles, you're actually doing in your action. By acting that way, you're confessing a truth. You're confessing an idea. Okay, just to put that into practical terms, I just said that as Christians, we believe that people are different from cows and mosquitoes. That has practical implications. If I go out and murder someone, my action carried a truth proposition or a claim at truth. What I did said to the world, hey everybody, I don't believe that people are really different from animals. Or at least, I am willing to harm this person if it's good enough for me. I don't value this person as an eternal soul. So my action said something. My action taught something. My actions are speaking. And we'll return to that as an important emphasis for how we think about ethics. Finally, I want to move out of these kinds of questions, and I want to talk then about ethics as summarized by biblical passages. And to do this, I'm going to move pretty quickly through a group of passages. I just want you to follow these passages as what I'm going to call kind of really foundational passages for giving us a biblical philosophy of ethics, or for how we think about ethics. So the first of these passages is Proverbs 1:1-7. Let's read this together. Proverbs 1:1-7, giving you an ethic for life that sounds like this. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning. A man of understanding will attain to wise counsels. But here's the foundation. I'm skipping ahead just to the last verse. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, just to clarify what I'm doing with that, or why I include that passage, I'm happy to say that the entire book of Proverbs goes on to summarize ethics. The entire book of Proverbs, and I mean arguably all of Scripture really, is giving you an ethical framework. Here's how you ought to live. But I'd like to highlight from that introduction to the book of Proverbs that that's expressed in terms of wisdom. It's going to be an important category for us as we proceed through ethics. Ethics related to, biblically speaking, wisdom would have a richness to it, because we define ethics and we define wisdom as not just what do you do when the guy comes to your door and he's going to hurt you, the difficult, weird, hard questions. But we define ethics or wisdom as the art of living well. Ethics teaches you how to live life well. A second passage that works like this, Ecclesiastes 12. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or it be evil. A couple of things I'd love to highlight about this. And number one, in keeping with our discussion, ethics that is so practical is concerned or wrapped up with the question of what is good and what is not good. So I have to answer those questions. What is actually worth doing, or what is beautiful, and what is worthy of being rebuked or repudiated or rejected? What is good or evil? I'd also like to notice in this passage that ethics here is founded upon the judgment of God. God is the judge for ethics. God tells us what is ultimately good or beautiful, right or not right, what ought to be done. And, in fact, a foundation for ethics stretching into eternity. We will see the conclusion of ethics when God judges the world and he sets right all of the actions that have been done. Notice here that God will bring every work into judgment. Exactly nothing will escape the judgment of ethics. But finally, I'd like us to notice here as the guidelines for ethics. The verse gives us two things: fear God and keep his commandments. And what I'd like to highlight about that is that there is a standard. Ethics, biblical ethics, or a Christian ethic, it's not just, find something that works for you, or each person has their own view. Well, this culture or this time or this group of people or this group of people, this person and their view. It's not like that. Actually, there is an objective floor for ethics. I recognize ethics can be complicated, and yes, ethics can vary by culture or by person or by situation. That's true. But the floor, the foundation, the core, the grounding for ethics is none other than the commandments of God. In fact, in some other ideas that I would like to build later, you can say that a certain thing, or you ought to say a certain thing is right or wrong, good or not good, true or not true, resting on the foundation of what God has declared to be true or not true, right or wrong, good or not good. God's authority, God's words, ultimately God's nature are the foundations for ethics. How do I know that something is good? Because God has said it is good. He has declared it to be that way. Let's move on then to a few more passages and complete our picture. It's just an attempt to get a broad survey of the entire picture of ethics as Scripture describes it. Here's another passage that just gives, I think, a beautiful window into the richness of the biblical concepts. He has showed thee, O man, what is good. What did the Lord require of you? But to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. If you break those things down, you can see that there are three expressions: to do justly or to live righteously, to love mercy, to be gracious and loving towards the people around you, and third, to walk humbly with God. Ethics is rooted in a relationship with God. You don't just do a proper ethic outside without being connected to Him. As I said just a moment ago, He is the ultimate foundation always of our ethic. And a few more summary passages like this. Matthew 22, this is Jesus speaking now, in a string of passages or a string of ideas that stretch far beyond just this passage, and I'll show you what I mean by that. But Jesus speaking to someone about the greatest commandment, they asked him, what is the greatest commandment? Jesus answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. A second is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, again, I've got those as two basic commands that are put in here together. Number one, love God. And number two, you love your neighbor. So loving towards Him, loving outwards towards other people. Both of those rooted, of course, the shared component, love. If I move outward from Jesus' teaching, I'm going to find that this is repeated in the epistles. So Paul in Romans 13 starts to repeat the different commands. You'll recognize them as the 10 Commandments. Commit adultery, murder, steal, covet, any other commandment. And then Paul comments this. All of these are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And what he's just done is drawn from Jesus' teaching when Jesus said that the greatest commandment is love. Paul has extended that. Similarly, James 2, if you fulfill the royal law according to Scripture, you will love your neighbor as yourself. All of these passages are resting upon Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself, I am the Lord. And actually, Jesus is quoting that when you talk about these passages. So another observation that's very common from ethics is the recognition that ethics is built on love. A comment just to clarify one or two things here. When we talk about love in that sense, in a biblical sense, we might be tempted, or it might be a popular way of thinking about love. Love is just broad, free acceptance. Okay, well, I accept you as you are, I accept him as he is, and everybody's okay. We just love everybody. Obviously, the biblical framework for love, genuine, legitimate love, is a much richer category. And the much richer category here is, if I truly love someone, I don't just confirm them in their error. Oh, well, you're okay, it'll be okay. No, they're actually not okay. To truly love someone is sometimes to speak hard things to them, to speak truth to them that might even hurt, to correct something that's gone wrong in their thinking. Yes, all of this is also part of genuine, true, biblical love. And love might include rebuking sin. A final passage that you ought to be aware of, and I'm not going to read this passage because you're quite familiar with it already, but a very good ethical foundation for our entire discussion, Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments. And I would like you to read down through this passage on your own time if you work down through, you're going to notice some things that are really interesting. On many of the commandments, you're going to have explanations or arguments why you ought to do things. For instance, God says, you will have no other gods before me. Why? Well, the answer or the foundation for that command, and for all the commands actually, is God himself. I am the Lord your God. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. Why would you have any other God? You would not make any graven image. Don't make an idol. Don't make a likeness of anything in heaven or on earth or anywhere like that. Any kind of image. Do not bow yourself to them nor serve them. Why? Because I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Why? The Lord will not hold him guiltless that takes his name in vain. So another concept I'd like to draw in here for ethics is the recognition that we do certain things, we act ethically, and it's built upon what I said earlier, what I argued earlier, on the foundation of who God is, the truth about him. And that takes me out to conclude with two concepts, just to wrap up our discussion here today. We talk about ethics, and I gave my definition of ethics as ethics teaches you to live well. And I think that already raises a point that you ought to know about ethics, which is this. You can't avoid doing ethics. There's no way to get around ethics. There's no way to just, well, I'll just sit this one out, or I'll just try to find another way or something. Ethics is too complicated. I'd rather avoid the whole thing. Can we do something else, please? There is no option like that. That is not one of the options on the table. Why not? Well, because ethics is not just telling you when you should fight a war or not fight a war, when you should defend yourself, when you should not defend yourself, or whether you should obey the government and pay your taxes or not. I mean, ethics is not just in the kind of complex situations. Ethics is not just for specialists. It's not just for decisions you need to make at the end of someone's life, or whether you're going to decide that cloning is okay or genetic manipulation is okay. It's not just that. Ethics is telling you how to live all of life. It's telling you how to live well. And you can't do anything about the fact that you're alive. I mean, you're here, you exist, and you will live somehow. You will live foolishly or wisely. You will live successfully in a true biblical sense. You will live well, or you'll live stupidly. You will live in a way that fulfills a meaningful existence, or you'll waste your life. But you can't avoid living. And what that means is every person is an ethicist. Every person is making ethical decisions. You can't avoid them. You have to do these things. Everyone is ethical. And on that definition, or on the framework that we've just described then, I'm inviting you in this class. I'm inviting you not just to explore some kind of curiosities, some challenging, weird situations where we're not sure how to decide between right and wrong. We'll do a little bit of that. I'm inviting you to something much bigger. I'm inviting you, together with me, in this discussion, more significantly, in conversation with Scripture, studying Scripture. I'm inviting you to study and give effort and diligence to learn how to live well. Ethics teaches you the best way to live your life. And by God's grace, I trust, you will learn to live